January 17th, 1945, Bastogne, Belgium. Dawn. The snow fell in silence, thick and relentless, blanketing the Ardennes forest in white that seemed to swallow sound itself. Colonel Hans von Luck stood at the edge of a frozen road, breath clouding before his face, watching the horizon through field glasses caked with frost. He had been a soldier for 6 years, had witnessed the blitzkrieg tear through Poland and France, had commanded panzer units across the endless Russian steppes where cold meant death and distance meant despair. He knew war, he knew armor, he knew logistics. But what he saw now, emerging through the snow like a mechanical river that had no beginning and no end, defied everything he understood about the possible limits of modern warfare. A convoy of American tanks stretched before him, Sherman after Sherman, interspersed with half-tracks, supply trucks, fuel tankers, ambulances, jeeps, artillery pieces, all moving in disciplined columns that disappeared into the fog and snow behind them and ahead of them simultaneously. Von Luck lowered his glasses. His hands, even in gloves, trembled, not from cold, but from a creeping realization that settled into his chest like winter into stone. He had spent the morning calculating, counting, estimating. The numbers were impossible, and yet they moved. "They have brought an entire nation to war," he whispered to his adjutant, a young lieutenant who still believed in final victory, who still spoke of wonder weapons and strategic reserves. Not just an army, a nation. The lieutenant nodded, not understanding. How could he? To truly comprehend what rolled past them required more than observation. It required context. It required memory. It required understanding what war had been, what logistics had meant, what limits had always existed, until now. In the summer of 1940, when German forces swept through France in 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht moved with a speed that stunned the world. Panzer divisions sliced through the Ardennes, bypassed the Maginot Line, and raced to the Channel coast, encircling Allied armies in a maneuver so swift, so decisive, that it seemed to rewrite the rules of warfare itself. But those who studied the campaign closely, who examined the operational reports and supply manifests, who spoke to the tank commanders and logistics officers, understood a truth that propaganda obscured. The Wehrmacht had nearly run out of fuel 3 times during the French campaign. Panzer divisions had outrun their supply lines repeatedly. Tanks had sat idle for crucial hours, sometimes days, waiting for fuel trucks to catch up. The blitzkrieg succeeded not because German logistics were superior, but because French and British responses were slower, more confused, more paralyzed by the pace of events than the Germans were starved of supplies. Every army in history had faced this iron law. Advance too quickly, and you outrun your logistics. Advance too slowly, and you sacrifice momentum. The solution was balance, careful planning, calculated risk. Commanders learned to think in terms of range and resupply, to measure advances in days of fuel consumption, to understand that every mile forward was a mile added to vulnerable supply lines stretching back to railheads and depots. The German army understood this intimately. They had studied Napoleon's campaigns, had analyzed the logistical failures in Russia, had built their doctrine around the concept of operational reach, the distance a military unit could advance before its combat power degraded to ineffectiveness due to supply limitations. Their staff officers were trained to calculate fuel consumption rates, ammunition expenditure, maintenance requirements. They knew, with mathematical precision, how far a panzer division could advance, how long it could fight, when it would need to pause and consolidate while supplies caught up. This was not unique to Germany. Every modern army operated under these same constraints. The British in North Africa, the Soviets in their counter-offensives, the Japanese in China, all faced the same fundamental equation. Combat power divided by distance, multiplied by time, equals logistical strain. Push too hard, and the equation collapsed. The supply lines snapped. The offensive stalled. Soldiers went hungry. Tanks ran dry, ammunition ran out. This was simply the nature of industrial warfare. When American forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, German intelligence officers expected the same patterns, the same limitations. the same inevitable pauses and consolidations that characterized all military operations. They anticipated that American forces would establish beachheads, build up supplies, advance carefully, halt to resupply, advance again, halt again, the standard rhythm of warfare that had governed military operations since armies had grown too large to live off the land. They were wrong. Catastrophically, fundamentally wrong. The first reports came from Normandy in late June, barely 3 weeks after D-Day. A Wehrmacht intelligence officer named Major Klaus Becker compiled field reports from frontline units engaging American forces near St. Lo. The reports confused him. Units reported encountering American armored columns that seemed to operate without regard to fuel constraints. Sherman tanks advanced, engaged, withdrew, repositioned, advanced again, all in the same day, movements that should have exhausted their fuel supplies. Yet the next day, the same units were operational, fully fueled, advancing again. Becker initially attributed this to exaggeration, to the fog of war, to demoralized soldiers overestimating enemy capabilities. But reports continued. American units maintained offensive operations continuously, day after day, without the expected pauses for resupply. Artillery batteries fired at rates that should have exhausted their ammunition within hours, yet continued firing for days. Infantry divisions advanced at speeds that suggested motorization levels that seemed wasteful, excessive, impossible. He requested aerial reconnaissance. The Luftwaffe, still capable of occasional sorties despite Allied air superiority, sent up photo reconnaissance aircraft over American rear areas. The photographs that came back changed Becker's understanding of the war. Behind American front lines, roads were packed with vehicles. Not scattered supply trucks making occasional runs, but continuous streams of transport, bumper to bumper, stretching back 30, 40, 50 miles to the beaches. Aerial analysts counted vehicles in sectors and extrapolated. The numbers seemed wrong. They recounted. The numbers remained impossible. In a single supply route between the beaches and frontline units, American forces were operating more trucks than the entire Wehrmacht possessed on the Western Front. Becker wrote in his intelligence summary, "The Americans have not sent an army to France. They have sent a supply system that happens to include an army." His superiors dismissed the report as defeatist. The numbers had to be wrong. No nation could produce such quantities. No military could organize such abundance. It defied economic logic, industrial possibility, operational sense. But the reports kept coming, and the American advance never paused. German officers had expected American soldiers to be soft, unprepared, children of luxury thrust into the harsh realities of war. This was the narrative that sustained morale in the Wehrmacht, the belief that decadent democracies could not produce warriors to match the hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. They expected Americans to break easily, to retreat in confusion, to lack the discipline and endurance that years of brutal combat had forged in German units. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate winter offensive launched in December 1944, was predicated partly on this assumption. German forces would strike through the Ardennes, split American lines, capture supply depots, seize the port of Antwerp, and demonstrate that the soft Americans could not withstand a determined assault by veteran troops. The plan required capturing American fuel supplies, because German forces, crippled by Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants, could not sustain the offensive with their own diminishing reserves. They would advance, overwhelm American positions, and refuel using captured supplies. It was audacious, it was desperate, and for the first week, it nearly worked. Panzer units smashed through surprised American positions, creating a bulge in Allied lines that threatened to become a breakthrough. German soldiers overran American depots, captured equipment, took prisoners. They found supplies in quantities that shocked them, not just ammunition and fuel, but food, rations so abundant, so rich, that veteran German soldiers who had survived on black bread and thin soup for years stood in captured supply dumps and wept at the waste, at the excess, at the casual abundance of an enemy that discarded food better than what Wehrmacht officers received in their mess halls. One panzer commander, Oberstleutnant Otto Remer, recorded in his diary the contents of an American supply truck his unit captured near Malmedy. Canned meat of quality I have not seen since before the war. Coffee, real coffee, not the roasted acorn substitute we drink. Chocolate, cigarettes in quantities that suggest they are issued like rifle cartridges, but most shocking, canned peaches, sweet and golden, fruit, in December, in winter, in war. My men devoured it immediately, frantically, like starving children. These are the supplies of ordinary soldiers. What kind of nation fights a war where common infantry eat like pre-war aristocrats? But abundance in captured depots was different from abundance in motion, in sustainment, in continuous operational supply. German commanders still believed they could disrupt American logistics, could cut supply lines, could create the same chaos and paralysis that had worked against French and British forces in 1940. They believed that distance in winter and their own desperate ferocity would eventually expose the limits of American supply chains. They were wrong. The American supply system had no limits they could find. Colonel von Luck, watching that endless convoy in the snow, had begun to understand this weeks earlier. After German forces failed to capture significant American fuel supplies, after their offensive stalled not from American counterattacks but from their own fuel exhaustion, after panzer divisions sat immobilized while American forces regrouped and reinforced, von Luck had started asking questions, talking to other officers, examining intelligence reports, trying to understand the mechanics of what he was witnessing. The numbers were staggering. American forces in Europe received supplies through a logistical system called the Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy route that operated continuously from Normandy beaches to frontline units. At its peak, the Red Ball Express moved over 12,000 tons of supplies per day. 12,000 tons per day. The entire Wehrmacht supply system for all fronts, eastern, western, southern Scandinavia, moved roughly 15,000 tons per day total. The Americans were moving nearly that much just to supply forces in one theater, on one front, for one army group. Behind the Red Ball Express lay production numbers that seemed more like propaganda than reality. American factories in 1944 produced 17,000 tanks, 96,000 aircraft, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 44 million tons of shipping. These were not projections or goals. These were actual production figures, verified by post-war records. While German factories struggled under Allied bombing, starved of raw materials, dependent on slave labor to maintain minimal production levels, American industry operated at full capacity 3 shifts 24 hours per day, producing war material in quantities that exceeded consumption rates. This created a phenomenon unprecedented in military history, an army that could not outrun its logistics because its logistics were faster, more mobile, more abundant than its combat forces. American units advancing across France in the summer of 1944 did not pause to wait for supplies. Supplies pursued them, caught up with them, sometimes passed them. Tank units pulled off roads to rest, and supply trucks were already there, waiting, offloading fuel and ammunition before the tank crews had finished their coffee. German officers trained in careful logistics management, in husbanding scarce resources, in calculating down to the last liter of fuel and last kilogram of bread, could not comprehend this. It violated everything they understood about warfare. Armies were supposed to be constrained by supply. That was the fundamental limitation that shaped strategy, that determined operational tempo, that forced difficult choices between speed and sustainability. Remove that constraint, and warfare became something different, something alien, something that resembled less a chess match of careful moves and more an avalanche of material that simply buried opposition under weight of abundance. Von Luck articulated this in a letter he wrote but never sent, found in his papers after the war. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an economic system that has decided to express itself militarily. Every German soldier is precious, must be husbanded, must be supplied with exactly calculated rations and ammunition because our nation is at the limit of its capacity. Every American soldier is backed by resources so vast that waste is irrelevant. They fire artillery barrages that consume more shells in an hour than our factories produce in a week. They are not more brave or more skilled. They are simply more, infinitely more, and more wins wars. The symbolic object that haunted German soldiers who fought Americans was not a weapon or a flag. but something mundane, something that should have been trivial: the tin can. American rations came in cans, metal containers that preserved food that could be heated, eaten, and discarded. German soldiers, many of whom had not seen canned food since before the war, began collecting empty American ration cans. They used them for cooking, for carrying water, for storing personal items. The cans became tokens of enemy abundance, physical evidence of industrial capacity that outmatched anything Germany could produce. But the cans also represented something deeper, something philosophical that German soldiers struggled to articulate. In Wehrmacht doctrine, soldiers were expected to endure hardship, to sacrifice, to suffer for the cause. Deprivation was almost valorized, a test of will and dedication. The Hitler Youth sang songs about marching on empty stomachs, about enduring cold and hunger for the fatherland. Hardship was proof of commitment. American soldiers experienced war differently. They were not asked to suffer needlessly. Their supply system existed to maximize combat effectiveness by minimizing deprivation. Well-fed soldiers fought better. Warm soldiers fought better. Soldiers with adequate equipment and ammunition fought better. This was not softness or luxury. It was applied industrial logic. America could produce abundance, so abundance became a weapon. German soldiers, encountering this philosophy in physical form, experienced cognitive dissonance. The enemy that propaganda had described as soft and decadent somehow produced soldiers who were better equipped, better fed, better supplied than Germany's hardened veterans. The nation that Hitler had dismissed as mongrelized and weak somehow outproduced Germany by factors of 10 or 20 in every industrial category. The military that German strategists had expected to break under pressure somehow sustained offensive operations continuously for 11 months, from Normandy to Berlin, without significant pauses or operational setbacks due to logistics failures. An artillery officer named Hauptmann Werner Heinz, captured in the Rhineland in March 1945, was interrogated by American intelligence. The interrogation transcript records an exchange that illuminates this realization. Interrogator: did you believe Germany could win the war? Heinz: until I saw your supply columns, yes. We knew we were outnumbered. We knew you had more tanks, more aircraft, but we believed quality could overcome quantity, that our training and experience and will would prevail. Then I watched your trucks. For 3 days, your trucks passed our position continuously before your infantry even arrived. 3 days. Trucks carrying ammunition, food, fuel, equipment. Thousands of trucks. We counted until counting became meaningless. And I understood we had not been fighting superior soldiers. We had been fighting superior factories. And one cannot defeat factories with will. The transformation in German officer thinking happened gradually, unevenly, resisted by some until the very end. Many clung to faith in wonder weapons, in secret projects, in the Führer's genius, in the possibility that will and fanaticism could overcome material reality. But for those whose duties required them to study enemy capabilities, to analyze intelligence, to understand logistical realities, the transformation was unavoidable and crushing. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, was one of Hitler's closest military advisors. He had helped plan every major German offensive, had coordinated operations across all theaters, had access to intelligence from every front. In April 1945, with Soviet forces entering Berlin and American forces across the Rhine, Hitler demanded Jodl explain how victory was still possible. Jodl's response, recorded by stenographers who documented Hitler's final conferences, was remarkable for its honesty. Mein Führer, the Americans have deployed an industrial capacity that we did not know existed and could not have countered if we had known. Their tank production in 1944 alone exceeded our total tank production for the entire war. Their logistical system delivers supplies to frontline units faster than our system delivers to units 50 kilometers behind our own lines. They are not winning through superior strategy or tactics. They are winning through abundance so overwhelming that our combat power is irrelevant. We can destroy 10 of their tanks, and 20 arrive the next day. We can eliminate a battalion, and 2 battalions replace it within a week. It is not a war. It is industrial extermination. Hitler, according to the stenographic record, called Jodl a defeatist and dismissed him, but the truth of Jodl's assessment was evident to anyone willing to see it. The impossibility of American tank convoys was not that they existed, but that they never stopped. From the moment American forces broke out of Normandy in late July 1944, supply convoys operated continuously, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, regardless of weather, bombing, or German counterattacks. The Red Ball Express drove with headlights off at night, navigating by moonlight and instinct, maintaining schedules that would have been ambitious in peacetime. Drivers, many of them African-American soldiers assigned to segregated logistics units, worked shifts that exhausted them to collapse, then woke and drove again. German attempts to interdict these convoys were sporadic and ineffective. Luftwaffe aircraft that survived Allied air superiority occasionally attacked supply columns, destroying a dozen trucks, perhaps 2 dozen, then were driven off or shot down. The convoys paused, pushed burning wrecks off roads, and continued. The loss rate was negligible compared to replacement rate. New trucks driven by new drivers carrying new supplies filled gaps within hours. Panzer units attempting to cut supply routes found the routes defended not just by combat troops, but by the logistics soldiers themselves, who fought as infantry when attacked, then returned to driving when the attack was repelled. American supply soldiers were armed, trained, organized to defend their convoys in ways that German logistics troops were not. The Americans had militarized their entire supply chain, had created a system where there was no vulnerable rear area, no soft target, no weak link that could be broken to collapse the entire structure. Colonel von Luck, in his post-war memoir, described attempting to raid an American supply depot in January 1945. We approached what we believed was a logistics target, expecting resistance from rear echelon troops, perhaps a few guards. We encountered a defended position with interlocking fields of fire, organized perimeter defense, and rapid reinforcement when we attacked. We withdrew after taking casualties we could not afford. Later, I learned the depot was staffed by Quartermaster Corps soldiers, not combat infantry. The Americans had no rear area in the sense we understood it. Everyone was a soldier first, a specialist second. Their logistics system was also a military force, capable of defending itself, capable of fighting while simultaneously supplying. We had never conceived of such integration. By spring of 1945, as American forces crossed the Rhine and drove into the heart of Germany, the psychological impact of American logistics on German forces was as devastating as the combat operations themselves. German soldiers defending their homeland saw American supply columns rolling past liberated villages, saw food and medicine distributed to civilians, saw destruction followed immediately by reconstruction efforts, by engineering units rebuilding bridges even as combat units advanced beyond them. This was the aspect of American military power that propaganda had not prepared them for. The demonstration that abundance was not an accident of geography or fortune, but a product of economic and political systems that could be replicated, that represented choices about how societies organized themselves. German soldiers had been taught that democracy was weak, chaotic, inefficient. They had been told that authoritarian discipline and centralized control produced superior outcomes. Yet here was evidence in physical, undeniable form that democratic industrial capitalism had out-organized, out-produced, and out-fought the most disciplined military machine Europe had seen since Napoleon. A young German lieutenant named Peter Bam, who served as a military doctor and later wrote extensively about his war experiences, reflected on this realization. We were told Americans were individualistic, undisciplined, incapable of collective effort, yet their military logistics represented coordination of millions of individuals across an entire continent, synchronized to deliver exact supplies to exact locations at exact times. Our system, supposedly superior in its centralized control, could not feed our own soldiers adequately. Their system, supposedly chaotic and individualistic, produced abundance that seemed limitless. I began to question what I had been taught about the strengths of authoritarianism and the weaknesses of democracy. This was the deeper threat that American tank convoys represented, not just military defeat, but ideological defeat. Every truck, every tank, every supply crate was evidence that the American system worked better, produced more, organized more effectively than the system German soldiers had been taught to believe in. The convoys were not just logistics. They were propaganda in motion, arguments made in steel and rubber and gasoline, that democracy could outfight dictatorship not despite its freedoms, but because of them. In April 1945, as American forces approached the Elbe River and prepared to link up with Soviet forces advancing from the east, a German staff officer named Oberst Günther Reichhelm was tasked with assessing remaining Wehrmacht capabilities for a last defense of Berlin. His report, classified at the time and discovered in archives decades later, included a section analyzing comparative logistics that represented perhaps the clearest German military acknowledgement of American supply superiority. Reichhelm calculated that Wehrmacht forces in the West possessed fuel reserves sufficient for approximately 3 days of combat operations, ammunition for perhaps 5 days, food for a week if rationing continued. Replacement equipment and reinforcements were non-existent. Industrial production had ceased in most sectors. The supply system had collapsed under Allied bombing and the loss of occupied territories that had provided raw materials. American forces facing them, according to Reichhelm's intelligence estimates, possessed supply reserves sufficient for months of continuous operations, were receiving reinforcements and equipment at rates that exceeded losses, and operated logistics systems that were expanding rather than contracting as they advanced into Germany. Reichhelm concluded, "We face an enemy that cannot be defeated by military means because military defeat requires exhausting enemy resources or breaking enemy will. The Americans possess resources we cannot exhaust and will sustained by continued success. Our situation is not analogous to previous military reversals that could be overcome through tactical brilliance or strategic repositioning. We face systemic defeat, the defeat of one economic model by another." The report was suppressed. German leadership in those final weeks oscillated between fantasies of miraculous reversal and bitter determination to fight to the last, acknowledging systemic defeat, admitting that the entire ideological foundation of the Third Reich had been proven inferior by empirical test of war was unacceptable. So the war continued for a few more weeks until Berlin fell and Hitler committed suicide and what remained of German forces surrendered unconditionally. In the immediate aftermath of German surrender, as American forces occupied Germany and began processing millions of prisoners of war, military intelligence officers conducted thousands of interviews with captured German soldiers and officers. The interviews were intended to gather intelligence about German military capabilities, organization, and operations, to build comprehensive understanding of the Wehrmacht for historical and strategic purposes. One recurring theme emerged from these interviews noted by multiple intelligence officers in their summary reports. German soldiers were not shocked by their military defeat in tactical or operational terms. Many could point to specific battles or campaigns where German forces had fought effectively, had demonstrated tactical proficiency, had sometimes achieved local victories. What shocked them, what they returned to repeatedly in their interviews, was the scale of American material superiority. They had not lost because they were poor soldiers. They had lost because they were fighting against an economic and industrial system that could produce abundance faster than they could create scarcity. A prisoner of war camp commander at one of the larger American facilities in southern Germany reported a conversation with a captured Wehrmacht major who had commanded a panzer battalion in France in 1944. He told me that before encountering American forces, he had believed the accounts of American industrial production were propaganda, exaggerations designed to demoralize German forces. Then he watched an American artillery barrage expend more ammunition in 2 hours than his entire battalion had been allocated for a month of operations. He said it was like fighting a natural force, an avalanche or flood, something beyond human scale, something against which courage and skill were irrelevant. This was the psychological victory embedded in American logistics, the demonstration that quantity, dismissed by German doctrine as inferior to quality, could reach levels where quality became irrelevant. That abundance, treated by Nazi ideology as decadent and weak, could become a weapon more devastating than any superweapon or tactical innovation. That democracy, ridiculed as chaotic and undisciplined, could organize industrial might that crushed the most militarized society in Europe. The symbolic power of the tin can return in an unexpected way in the years after the war. As Germany lay in ruins, as its population faced starvation in the first post-war winter, American occupation forces implemented relief programs that delivered food to prevent mass famine. The food came in familiar containers, tin cans marked with American military labels, the same cans German soldiers had scavenged from battlefields, the same physical embodiment of abundance that had haunted their final years of war. German children, born during the war or too young to remember peacetime, learned to recognize American food cans before they learned to read German script. The cans became symbols of survival, objects of desperate desire, currencies of exchange in ruined cities. And in a profound historical irony, the same logistics system that had delivered military defeat to Germany now delivered survival to its population. American military officials, many of whom had overseen supply operations during combat, now redirected those same systems to humanitarian purposes. Trucks that had carried ammunition now carried food aid. Supply depots that had fueled offensives now distributed medicine and clothing to displaced civilians. The infrastructure of war became the infrastructure of peace, with the same efficiency, the same abundance, the same overwhelming scale. Some German officers, witnessing this transformation, experienced a final ideological collapse. They had fought for a system that promised strength through sacrifice, glory through suffering, victory through will. That system had led them to defeat, destruction, and moral catastrophe. Now their former enemies were feeding their children, rebuilding their cities, demonstrating that abundance was not weakness, but strength, that democracy was not chaos, but organized power, that the values they had been taught to despise had survived the test of war and proven superior. Oberst Reichhelm, the staff officer who had written the suppressed analysis of systemic defeat, survived the war and later wrote a memoir reflecting on his experiences. We were taught that hardship builds character, that suffering purifies, that a nation becomes strong through denial and discipline. The Americans taught us, through their tin cans and supply trucks and endless convoys, that a nation becomes strong through prosperity shared widely, through industrial capacity deployed for collective benefit, through systems that maximize human potential rather than demanding human sacrifice. We called them soft. They defeated us. We called them weak. They rebuilt us. It took me years to understand that we had been taught to admire precisely the wrong virtues. The story of American tank convoys in France, of German officers confronting an impossible logistics system, is not ultimately a story about tanks or trucks or supply chains. It is a story about systems, about ideologies tested by the most rigorous examination possible: war. The German military in 1940 seemed unstoppable, seemed to have discovered new principles of warfare that rendered previous military wisdom obsolete. But the Blitzkrieg, for all its tactical brilliance, was built on a foundation of inadequate logistics, sustained by exploitation of conquered territories, dependent on gambles that eventually failed. The American military in 1944 appeared slow, methodical, overwhelming, but not innovative. German officers initially saw American tactics as unsophisticated, American soldiers as untested, American equipment as adequate but unexceptional. What they failed to recognize, what their ideology prevented them from recognizing until too late, was that American military power rested on foundations far more robust than tactical doctrine or individual weapon systems. It rested on an economic system capable of mobilizing entire continental resources, on an industrial base that could sustain production levels impossible for more centralized economies, on a political system that could coordinate voluntary collective effort across hundreds of millions of people. The convoys that German officers called impossible were possible because they emerged from a society organized around principles of abundance rather than scarcity. around expansion rather than conquest, around systems designed to maximize production rather than extract maximum sacrifice. The tin cans that symbolized this abundance were not luxuries. They were manifestations of industrial capacity, of supply chains optimized across oceans and continents, of economic systems that generated surplus rather than merely distributing scarcity. When Colonel von Luck stood in the snow watching that convoy roll past, when he whispered that Americans had brought an entire nation to war, he was recognizing something more profound than simple material superiority. He was recognizing that the contest was never really between the Wehrmacht and the U.S. Army. It was between two visions of how societies organize power, create wealth, mobilize resources, and define strength. One vision had seemed triumphant in 1940, had appeared to prove that authoritarian efficiency could overcome democratic chaos. The other vision, tested by total war, demonstrated that free societies could outorganize, outproduce, and outfight the most disciplined military machine in history. In the decades after the war, as historians examined documents and interviewed survivors and reconstructed the decisions and events that shaped the conflict, the story of logistics gradually received more attention. Early histories focused on battles and generals, on dramatic moments and heroic decisions. But deeper analysis revealed that wars are decided not just by courage and tactics, but by the mundane mathematics of supply, by the unsexy calculations of fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure, by the organizational capacity to deliver millions of tons of material across thousands of miles to millions of soldiers continuously for years. The American logistics system in World War II represented an achievement as significant as any battlefield victory. It mobilized industrial capacity on a scale never before seen, coordinated shipping across both Atlantic and Pacific simultaneously, built infrastructure in foreign territories under combat conditions, and sustained the largest military deployment in history without significant supply failures. The system was not perfect. There were shortages, inefficiencies, mistakes, but it worked at a level that exceeded anything previously achieved and demonstrated principles of organization that would influence military logistics for generations. German officers who survived the war and later wrote memoirs or gave interviews frequently returned to American logistics as the factor they had underestimated most severely. They acknowledged tactical errors, strategic mistakes, moral catastrophes. But they also pointed to American supply capabilities as the factor that made German defeat inevitable once the United States committed fully to the conflict. "We could not have won," wrote General Major F.W. von Mellenthin in his post-war analysis. "Not because American soldiers were better than ours, but because America could replace everything we destroyed faster than we could destroy it. That is not a military capability. That is an economic capability that manifests militarily, and we had no counter for it." The epilogue to the story of impossible convoys is written not in military history but in the world that emerged from the war. The Marshall Plan, America's program to rebuild Western Europe, employed many of the same logistics systems and organizational principles that had sustained military operations. Supply ships that had carried tanks now carried food and medicine and industrial equipment. Military transportation networks became commercial infrastructure. The organizational knowledge developed to sustain war was redirected to support recovery and reconstruction. Europe rebuilt with American assistance, rebuilt faster than anyone thought possible, rebuilt into societies that adopted some of the principles: economic openness, democratic governance, industrial capacity, that had made American abundance possible. The tin cans became Marshall Plan aid packages. The convoys became civilian supply chains. The logistics system that had delivered military defeat became the system that delivered economic recovery. And in this transformation lies the final lesson that German officers learned: the ultimate impossibility that American convoys represented, that military power in modern industrial societies cannot be separated from economic power, from political systems, from cultural values, that a nation's strength in war reflects its strength in peace, that the same principles that create prosperity in civilian life create capability in military conflict, that abundance is not weakness but the foundation of every other kind of strength. Colonel von Luck, in his memoirs published decades after the war, reflected on that moment in the snow, watching the endless convoy. I saw the future that day, though I did not recognize it. I saw what victory looked like in the modern age, not glory or conquest, but capacity, the capacity to produce, to organize, to sustain, to deliver, the capacity to make impossible logistics possible, to turn scarcity into abundance, to prove that free peoples can mobilize more effectively than disciplined subjects. We lost the war in battles and campaigns, but we had already lost before the first shot was fired, lost to economic systems and political philosophies that we had been taught to despise, but could not defeat. The convoys were not impossible. We were impossible, impossible to continue, impossible to sustain, impossible to prevail against a system that valued creation over conquest, production over plunder, freedom over force. That is what Hitler's officers said when America deployed its impossible tank convoys in France. They said it in whispers at first, in suppressed reports, in private conversations. Then they said it in surrender, in prisoner interrogations, in the ruins of their ideology. They learned too late that abundance defeats sacrifice, that production defeats will, that systems matter more than soldiers. They learned that the convoys were not impossible at all. That defeat was the only impossibility they had ever faced, and the tin cans, scattered across battlefields and liberated cities, remained small cylindrical monuments to the victory of plenty over scarcity, of democracy over dictatorship, of a nation that brought not just an army to war, but itself in all its impossible abundance, until abundance became unstoppable, until logistics became destiny, until freedom proved to be the only strength that truly mattered.